Richard stood on the limestone steps of the Lake Forest estate, watching his plainly dressed wife load a scuffed suitcase into a standard rideshare. He felt only the triumphant relief of discarding dead weight, completely unaware he had just evicted the sole owner of the $12 million mansion. Richard Campbell was a man who believed his own press. At 39, he had just been named a senior vice president at Kensington Wealth Management, an elite financial advisory firm in downtown Chicago. To Richard, this promotion was the ultimate validation of his existence. It was proof that his aggressive networking, his tailored Brioni suits, and his relentless pursuit of status were not just personality traits, but a blueprint for objective superiority. He was pulling in just north of $400,000 a year, and in his mind, that made him a titan. But every titan has an Achilles' heel, and Richard was convinced his was his wife, Eleanor. When they met 10 years ago at a quiet coffee shop in Evanston, Eleanor's unassuming nature had been a balm to Richard's hyper-competitive anxiety. She was soft-spoken, wore her honey-blonde hair in a simple claw clip, and seemed perfectly content spending her weekends reading paperback novels or tending to houseplants. Back then, Richard was a stressed junior analyst, drowning in student debt, and Eleanor's grounded demeanor kept him sane. A decade later, however, Richard's perspective had violently shifted. As his income grew, so did his appetite for the superficial markers of success. He wanted reservations at Alinea, ski trips to Aspen, and a partner who looked like she belonged on the arm of a Wall Street conqueror. Eleanor, to his immense frustration, refused to upgrade her lifestyle, while the other executive wives at Kensington Wealth paraded around in pristine Chanel tweed and drove custom Range Rovers. Eleanor still drove a 2014 Subaru Outback. She preferred baking her own sourdough to attending charity galas. She wore faded Patagonia fleeces and unbranded, remarkably plain cashmere sweaters. When Richard gifted her a flashy Cartier love bracelet for their anniversary, she thanked him politely, but rarely wore it, claiming it clanked against the keyboard when she typed. Richard felt suffocated by her frugality. He felt she was anchoring him to a mediocre, middle-class aesthetic he had worked so desperately to escape. The only saving grace in their marriage, in Richard's eyes, was their home. They lived in a sprawling, breathtaking French provincial mansion on Sheridan Road in the ultra-exclusive suburb of Lake Forest. The estate boasted 6 bedrooms, a slate roof, an indoor conservatory, and manicured gardens that rolled gently down toward the edge of Lake Michigan. Richard often bragged about the house at the country club, but he was always careful to obscure the actual financial arrangement. Years ago, when they were still struggling, Eleanor had told him that a distant, wealthy great-aunt possessed the property through a holding company, Oak and Iron Holdings, LLC. The aunt, Eleanor claimed, spent all her time in Europe and offered to let them live in the vacant estate to keep it maintained. All they had to do was cover the administrative upkeep, which amounted to $4,500 a month. Richard had jumped at the chance. As his salary increased, he proudly took over that monthly payment, wiring the money to the LLC on the first of every month. He felt like the king of the castle. He was the breadwinner, paying the rent, keeping the lights on in a $12 million home. He began to view the house as his by right of occupancy and financial contribution. Eleanor just watered the hydrangeas. He paid the bills. Then came Chloe Davenport. Chloe was a newly hired wealth manager at Kensington. At 28, she was everything Eleanor was not. Fiercely ambitious, impeccably contoured, and dripping in designer labels. She drove a leased Porsche Macan, smelled heavily of Baccarat Rouge 540, and possessed a predatory charm that immediately zeroed in on Richard. Their affair started predictably. Late nights at the office reviewing portfolios, morphed into martinis at the London House rooftop bar. Chloe knew exactly how to play Richard. She stroked his ego with surgical precision. I just don't understand how a man like you, so driven, so sophisticated, deals with coming home to someone who doesn't match your energy. Chloe purred one evening, tracing the rim of her martini glass. She had scrolled through Richard's social media and seen exactly one photo of Eleanor, looking fresh-faced and simple in a denim jacket at a farmer's market. You need a partner, Richard. Someone who looks the part. Someone who can host your clients and elevate your brand. Richard swallowed the bait hook, line and sinker. She doesn't get it, he sighed, adjusting his Rolex. I'm carrying the entire weight of our lives. I pay for the lifestyle, the car insurance, the rent on the estate. She just exists. She's poor in spirit, Chloe. She lacks ambition. You deserve the world, Richard, Chloe whispered, leaning in so close her lips brushed his jaw. And you deserve to share that gorgeous Lake Forest house with someone who appreciates it. The seed was planted. Over the next 3 months, Richard's resentment toward Eleanor mutated into outright contempt. He stopped coming home for dinner. He criticized her clothes, sneering at her gardening boots left by the back door. He picked fights over nothing, hoping she would snap and give him an excuse to end it. But Eleanor never yelled. She simply looked at him with those deep, steady green eyes, eyes that held an emotion Richard mistook for weakness, but which was, in reality, a profound and quiet pity. Richard's 40th birthday was approaching in late October, and he decided he wasn't going to enter his next decade tethered to a peasant. Chloe had been applying pressure, refusing to sleep with him anymore until he made a definitive move. She wanted the title of girlfriend, and more importantly, she wanted the Sheridan Road mansion. Richard formulated his plan. He convinced himself that because he was the sole source of income and the one paying the $4,500 rent to the LLC, he held all the power. He drafted an email to the generic contact address for Oak and Iron Holdings, LLC, stating that he and his wife were separating, but that he, Richard Campbell, would be assuming sole responsibility for the property moving forward. He didn't wait for a reply. In his arrogance, he assumed the faceless property manager wouldn't care who lived there as long as the check cleared. On a freezing Friday evening, a storm brewing over Lake Michigan, Richard walked through the heavy mahogany double doors of the mansion. The house smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary. Eleanor was in the massive chef's kitchen, wearing her favorite oversized wool cardigan, pulling a Dutch oven out of the La Cornue range. "We need to talk," Richard said. His voice was cold, rehearsed. Eleanor set the pot on the marble island and wiped her hands on a towel. She didn't smile. "All right." Richard didn't sit down. He paced the length of the kitchen, projecting his voice as if addressing a boardroom. "I'm done, Eleanor. This marriage is a dead end. I am operating at a level you can't even comprehend, let alone support. I'm exhausted from dragging you upward. I want a divorce." Eleanor stood perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the wind rattling the heavy glass of the conservatory windows. "You want a divorce?" she repeated softly. "Yes. And I want you out." Eleanor finally blinked. "Out? Out of the house?" "Tonight!" Richard spat, his patience evaporating. The sight of her in that cheap wool sweater made his blood boil. "I've outgrown you, Eleanor. I have someone else. Someone who actually fits into my world, and she's moving in. I've already notified the holding company that I'm taking over the lease exclusively. Since I'm the one who actually pays the bills around here, I'm the one staying." For a long moment, Eleanor just stared at him. Richard expected tears. He expected her to collapse to the floor, to beg him to reconsider, to remind him of the vows they took when they had nothing. Instead, a strange, almost imperceptible shadow crossed Eleanor's face. She tilted her head slightly. "You notified the holding company?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "Yes. Now, go upstairs and pack whatever fits in your Subaru. I want you gone before the storm hits hard. I'll have movers box up the rest of your cheap junk and send it wherever you end up." "Richard," Eleanor said, taking one step forward. "Are you absolutely sure this is how you want to handle this? Throwing me out into the cold? No discussion? No mediation?" "There is nothing to discuss," Richard barked, slamming his hand on the marble island. "This is my life. I earned this. I earned this house. I earned my position, and I am taking what is mine. Now pack your bags." Eleanor looked at his red, contorted face. She let out a slow, quiet breath. "Okay." She turned and walked up the sweeping grand staircase. Richard stood at the bottom, his heart pounding with adrenaline and dark, intoxicating triumph. He had done it. He was free. He immediately pulled out his phone and texted Chloe. "It's done. She's leaving. Pack an overnight bag." 30 minutes later, Eleanor came down the stairs carrying a single, scuffed Samsonite suitcase. She had changed into a sensible waterproof trench coat. She walked past the priceless antique console tables and the imported baccarat chandeliers without giving them a second glance. "Leave your key," Richard demanded as she reached the front door. Eleanor reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key and placed it gently on the entryway table. She opened the door. The wind howled, blowing freezing rain onto the limestone porch. An Uber was waiting at the bottom of the circular driveway. She hadn't even bothered to take the Subaru. She turned back to look at Richard one last time. There was no anger in her eyes, only a chilling, absolute finality. "Goodbye, Richard. Enjoy the weekend." She walked out into the rain, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. Richard poured himself a glass of Lagavulin 16 and sank into the leather Chesterfield sofa. He had never felt more powerful. Less than an hour later, Chloe's Porsche roared into the driveway. She burst through the front doors, shaking rain from her designer umbrella, her eyes wide as she took in the soaring ceilings and the opulent dual staircase. "Oh my God," Chloe gasped, dropping her overnight bag. "Richard, this place is insane. It's like a palace. She really let you keep it." "She didn't have a choice, babe," Richard smirked, walking over to hand her a glass of champagne he had poured to celebrate. "I'm the one who holds the purse strings. The lease is mine. The house is ours." That weekend was a blur of indulgence. Richard and Chloe drank expensive wine, blasted music through the Sonos system, and christened the master bedroom. On Saturday night, they ordered catering from a high-end steakhouse in Chicago and invited 3 of Richard's closest colleagues from Kensington Wealth Management. Richard gave them a grand tour, puffing his chest out as he pointed out the original crown molding and the wine cellar. Chloe played the perfect hostess, laughing loudly and hanging on Richard's arm. It was the life he had always felt he deserved. He was finally a king with his queen. Sunday passed in a lazy, triumphant haze. Richard didn't spare a single thought for Eleanor. He didn't care where she slept or how she was surviving. She was erased from his reality. But reality has a funny way of asserting itself. On Monday morning, at exactly 8 a.m., Richard was standing in the kitchen, adjusting his silk tie and sipping espresso, while Chloe painted her nails at the island. They were getting ready to commute into the city together. The doorbell rang, a sharp, sustained buzz that echoed through the massive house. Frowning, Richard set down his cup. "Probably a delivery," he muttered, walking out to the grand foyer. He swung open the front door, Standing on the porch was not a delivery driver. It was a tall, severe-looking man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit. Behind him, parked in the driveway, was a black Lincoln Town car. The man held a thick manila envelope. "Richard Campbell?" the man asked. His tone was strictly professional, devoid of any warmth. "Yes." "Who are you?" Richard asked, instantly on edge. "My name is Thomas Vance." The man paused. "Apologies, Thomas Sterling. I am a senior partner at Winston & Strawn LLP. Richard's brow furrowed. Winston & Strawn was one of the most fearsome corporate law firms in Chicago. "What can I do for you, Mr. Sterling?" The lawyer extended the manila envelope. "I am here representing the ownership of this estate, Oak and Iron Holdings, LLC. You are being served with an immediate notice to vacate the premises for trespassing and breach of contract." Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Excuse me? There must be a mistake. I emailed the holding company on Friday. I pay the rent here. I'm taking over the lease." Thomas Sterling did not smile. He did not blink. He simply looked at Richard with a cold, piercing gaze. "There is no lease, Mr. Campbell," the lawyer said smoothly. "Oak and Iron Holdings LLC doesn't lease this property. The $4,500 you have been paying monthly does not even cover a fraction of the property taxes. It was a maintenance fee deposited into a blind trust." Richard felt a cold prickle of dread at the base of his neck. "What are you talking about? If there's no lease, who owns the house?" The lawyer opened a leather folio and pulled out a single sheet of watermarked paper, a deed of trust. He held it up so Richard could read the bold print at the top. "Oak and Iron Holdings, LLC, is a private shell company," the lawyer stated, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air like a scalpel. "It is wholly and exclusively owned by its sole beneficiary, Eleanor Josephine Miller." The air left Richard's lungs. He stared at the name on the paper. Eleanor. His Eleanor. "My client," the lawyer continued relentlessly, "owns this estate outright. It was purchased in cash by her maternal grandfather in 1998 and transferred to her name 7 years ago. As of Friday evening, you are no longer a permitted guest on her property. You have exactly 4 hours to remove yourself and your belongings before I dispatch the Lake Forest Police Department to arrest you for criminal trespassing." Richard's brain short-circuited. He stared at the watermarked deed in Thomas Sterling's unyielding hand, the black ink forming words that violently dismantled his entire reality. Sole beneficiary. Eleanor Josephine Miller. "That's impossible," Richard stammered, the color draining from his face. His voice cracked, losing its rehearsed, executive baritone. "We've been married for 10 years. It's marital property. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. You can't just throw me out of my own house." Sterling finally offered a smile, though it was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a predator baring its teeth. "Illinois is indeed an equitable distribution state, Mr. Campbell. However, inheritances and assets held in a generation-skipping trust, established prior to the marriage, and maintained exclusively without commingling of marital funds, are strictly non-marital property. The $4,500 you paid monthly was legally documented as a voluntary contribution to the Oak and Iron Holding account. You were, in the eyes of the law, a tenant at will. And as of Friday, when you sent an email explicitly stating you were separating from the owner and attempting to illegally seize the leasehead, you effectively terminated your own welcome. Who is at the door, babe?" Chloe's voice floated through the grand foyer. She rounded the corner, wearing one of Richard's expensive silk robes, a mug of espresso in her hand. She stopped dead when she saw the imposing lawyer and the black car in the driveway. "What's going on?" Chloe asked, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the mug. Sterling looked past Richard to Chloe. "I am Thomas Sterling, legal counsel for the owner of this estate. I am here to ensure Mr. Campbell vacates the premises by noon today." Chloe blinked, her gaze darting between Richard and the lawyer. "Owner? Richard is the owner. He pays the mortgage." "Richard pays a nominal maintenance fee," Sterling corrected smoothly. "The property is owned free and clear by Eleanor Miller. Your boyfriend is being evicted." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard watched in real time as the illusion he had so carefully crafted shattered in Chloe's eyes. The adoration, the predatory attraction, the calculation, it all vanished, replaced instantly by profound, naked disgust. "You don't own the house?" Chloe asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut deeper than a scream. "You threw your wife out of her own $12 million house." "Chloe, wait, I can explain." Richard reached for her, but she recoiled as if he were diseased. "Don't touch me," she snapped. She looked around the soaring limestone foyer, the baccarat chandeliers, the sweeping staircase. It hadn't belonged to the wealthy, powerful titan she thought she was seducing. It belonged to the quiet, unassuming woman in the cheap wool sweater. "You're a renter, Richard. A fraud. I am not getting dragged into a criminal trespassing charge." Without another word, Chloe turned on her heel and marched upstairs. 15 minutes later, she came back down, fully dressed, carrying her overnight bag. She didn't look at Richard. She walked straight past him, out the heavy oak doors and into her Porsche. The tires screeched on the wet pavement as she sped out of the driveway, leaving Richard entirely alone with Thomas Sterling. "You have 3 hours and 40 minutes, Mr. Campbell," Sterling noted, checking a platinum Patek Philippe watch. "I suggest you begin packing. A moving crew is waiting at the end of the street to assist with your personal items. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the electronics, belongs to the trust." The next 3 hours were the most humiliating of Richard's life. Gone was the dignified, calculated exit he had forced upon Eleanor. Instead, Richard scrambled frantically through the master suite, shoving his Brioni suits and Ferragamo shoes into heavy-duty trash bags provided by the movers. He was sweating profusely, his heart hammering against his ribs in a state of sustained panic. He tried calling Eleanor. Once, twice, 10 times. It went straight to voicemail. He tried texting her, pleading for her to answer, apologizing, begging for a conversation. Message not delivered. She had blocked him. At exactly 11:55 a.m., 2 Lake Forest police cruisers pulled into the circular driveway, parked silently behind Sterling's Lincoln. They didn't draw their weapons, but their presence was a suffocating reminder of Richard's sudden lack of power. He was escorted out of the front door, carrying a garbage bag full of silk ties. He stood on the limestone steps in the freezing drizzle, looking back at the magnificent French provincial estate. The house looked exactly the same, but the lens through which he viewed it had permanently altered. It was no longer his castle. It was an impenetrable fortress, and he was permanently locked out. Richard checked into a sterile, overpriced extended-stay Marriott near O'Hare Airport. The room smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stale air conditioning. He sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, surrounded by garbage bags, and opened his laptop. He needed to understand. He needed to know who Eleanor really was. He searched Eleanor Josephine Miller. For years he had known her family had some money, a grandfather in manufacturing or something mundane, but Eleanor had always downplayed it. He found a digitized article from a 1998 Chicago Tribune business section. Arthur Miller, founder of Miller Harrison Industrials, finalizes sale of global logistics network for $1.2 billion. Richard's blood ran cold. Billion. With a B. He kept digging, he found a society page from 2005 showing a young Eleanor at a charity gala, standing next to her grandfather. She was wearing a custom Oscar de la Renta gown, looking effortlessly regal. She hadn't been wearing cheap clothes during their marriage because she lacked taste. She wore them because she had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. She was generationally, profoundly wealthy. Her frugality wasn't a lack of ambition. It was the ultimate luxury of a woman who never had to worry about money a day in her life. Richard had spent 10 years trying to flex a $400,000 salary to a woman whose trust fund likely generated that amount in passive interest every month. The $4,500 he so proudly paid in rent probably didn't even cover the annual landscaping bill for the hydrangeas she tended. A wave of nausea washed over him. He had thrown away a diamond because he thought it was glass, entirely to pursue a rhinestone that had just abandoned him at the first sign of trouble. The professional guillotine dropped mere hours after the personal one. On Monday morning, Richard walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Kensington Wealth Management. He expected to easily slide back into his executive routine. Instead, he was met with averted eyes and toxic whispers. Before he could even boot up his computer, his desk phone chirped. It was David Harrington, the firm's ruthless managing partner. "Boardroom, now." Richard adjusted his wrinkled Brioni tie and walked down the mahogany corridor, desperately clinging to the only identity he had left: Senior Vice President. He pushed open the frosted glass doors and froze. David Harrington wasn't alone. Sitting across from him, sipping sparkling water, was Thomas Sterling, the Winston and Strawn attorney who had evicted Richard from his own life less than a day prior. "Sit down, Richard," Harrington ordered, his voice devoid of its usual golf course camaraderie. "We have a catastrophic hemorrhage on our hands." Sterling placed a familiar watermarked folder on the polished table. "3 weeks ago, Mr. Campbell, you were promoted based on a massive influx of capital into your managed portfolio. An anonymous private wealth trust transferred $85 million into Kensington's custody." Richard's mouth went dry. "The Oak and Iron Trust." "Precisely," Sterling smiled, a terrifying reptilian expression. "I represent that trust. My client, the sole beneficiary, has directed me to immediately liquidate all positions with Kensington and transfer the assets to Goldman Sachs. She feels that a firm employing an executive who exhibits such catastrophic moral and ethical bankruptcy cannot be trusted to manage her family's generational wealth." Richard felt the room tilt. The $85 million, the portfolio that had crowned him a titan. It hadn't been his brilliance or his aggressive networking. It was Eleanor. She had quietly moved her grandfather's manufacturing fortune into his firm simply to secure his promotion, anonymously building the very pedestal he had used to look down on her. "With the loss of the Oak and Iron account," Harrington interjected coldly, "your portfolio no longer meets the baseline for a junior analyst, let alone an SVP. Furthermore, Chloe Davenport filed a formal HR complaint at 8 a.m. this morning. She claims you leveraged your newly acquired title to coerce her into a relationship and completely misrepresented your marital assets to manipulate her." "Chloe," Richard gasped, completely blindsided. "She was the one pushing for the house. She was packing her bags to move in." "She is protecting her career from your radioactive fallout," Harrington stated flatly. "You are terminated, Richard. Effective immediately. Clear your desk." By noon, Richard was standing on the freezing pavement of LaSalle Street, holding a cardboard box. In less than 48 hours, he had lost his $12 million estate, his brilliant wife, his opportunistic mistress, and his prestigious career. 6 months later, the final blow was dealt in a sterile conference room at the Daily Centre. Richard arrived wearing a suit that hung loosely on his depleted frame. He was living in a damp, 400-square-foot walk-up in Rogers Park, burning through his meager savings while entirely blacklisted from every major financial institution in Chicago. The heavy oak door opened and Eleanor walked in. Richard's breath hitched. She was no longer wearing faded Patagonia fleeces. She was a vision of devastating, quiet luxury, draped in a tailored Brunello Cucinelli cashmere coat and carrying a vintage Hermes Kelly bag. She looked untouchable. Richard's bargain rate attorney cleared his throat, attempting to argue for spousal support, claiming Richard had grown accustomed to the opulent lifestyle of the Lake Forest estate. Thomas Sterling didn't even argue. He simply slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the email Richard had arrogantly sent to the LLC the night he kicked Eleanor out. I, Richard Campbell, will be assuming sole responsibility for the lease, as I have always been the primary financial provider. Mr. Campbell unequivocally stated in writing that the marital dynamic did not rely on the estate's assets, Sterling noted dryly. He explicitly acknowledged his status as a mere tenant and abandoned his spouse. We offer zero alimony. If he contests, we will pursue him for the emotional distress of an illegal eviction attempt. Richard's lawyer sighed, closing his briefcase. Take the deal, Richard. You have no leverage. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Richard looked up at the woman he had discarded. Eleanor, he whispered, tears prickling his eyes. I just didn't know. If I had known who you really were. Eleanor paused, her green eyes piercing right through his fragile ego. Her voice was steady and completely devoid of warmth. That is the tragedy of it, Richard, she said softly. You never actually looked at me. You only looked at what I could do for your reflection. You loved the mansion, but you despised the woman who gave you the keys. She signed the final page, stood up, and walked out, leaving Richard alone in the deafening silence of his ruined life. Richard Campbell traded a diamond for a rhinestone, entirely blinded by his own arrogance. He sits today in a cramped studio apartment, a bitter casualty of his catastrophic ego. Eleanor never sought revenge. She simply let his own greed orchestrate his downfall. True wealth, he learned too late, whispers, while crippling insecurity screams. He threw away an empire, only to discover he was never the king, just a foolish court jester.